Some people say your childhood shapes who you become. For me, that's undeniably true. My earliest memories aren't of playgrounds or birthday parties. They're of the smell of metal shavings and machine oil in my father's workshop. Where are you watching from today? Comment down below. I was 5 years old the first time my father brought me to his small manufacturing plant. Back then, it wasn't much, just a converted warehouse with secondhand equipment and a dozen employees. But to me, it was magical. The sounds of machinery humming, the focused expressions of the workers, the way my father commanded respect simply by walking through the door. I was mesmerized. "What do you think, princess?" he asked, lifting me up so I could see the assembly line. His hands were rough, calloused from years of manual labor before he could afford to hire others. "One day, all of this will be yours." Dad told me the story countless times, how he started the business with nothing but a loan from my grandfather and sheer determination. He'd worked 16-hour days, 7 days a week, sleeping on a cot in the back office to save money on rent. The first 5 years, he barely broke even. But he persisted. Dad wasn't just building a business, he was creating a legacy. Every Thursday after school, Dad would pick me up in his old pickup truck, the company logo freshly painted on the door, even though the truck itself was ancient. He'd bring me to the plant and let me shadow him. While other girls my age were taking ballet or playing with dolls, I was learning about profit margins and supply chain logistics. "You see that, Sarah?" he'd say, pointing to the intricate workings of a machine. "That's a CNC lathe. It can cut metal parts with precision down to 1,000th of an inch." I'd nod seriously, absorbing information like a sponge. By the time I was 10, I could explain our entire production process to visitors, much to their amusement and my father's unmistakable pride. My mother would often shake her head, concerned that I wasn't having a normal childhood. But Dad would just laugh. "Sarah's not meant for normal," he'd say. "She's meant for extraordinary." My brother Marcus came along when I was 7. From the beginning, he was different. While I gravitated toward the workshop, Marcus preferred staying home with his video games. Dad tried, of course. He'd bring Marcus along sometimes, attempting to spark the same passion in him that I had naturally developed. I remember one particular afternoon when I was 12. Dad had given me a small project, organizing the parts inventory. I'd developed a color-coded system that made finding specific components quicker. When I proudly showed him the results, he tousled my hair and said, "That's my girl, always making things better." Marcus was slouched in a chair nearby, playing a handheld game, completely disinterested. I felt a twinge of something. Not quite pity, not quite superiority, just the knowledge that Marcus and I were fundamentally different. As I entered my teens, my involvement in the company only deepened. While my classmates worried about prom dates and football games, I was reading business journals and studying manufacturing techniques. Dad started giving me real responsibilities, letting me sit in on vendor meetings, asking my opinion on equipment purchases. Meanwhile, Marcus drifted through high school with average grades and a succession of passing interests: guitar, skateboarding, video game design, none of which held his attention for long. Dad never pushed him the way he did me. With Marcus, he was content to let him find his own path. But with me, there was always an expectation, always the next goal to reach. "You need to understand every part of this business if you're going to run it someday," Dad would say. And I never questioned it. My future was set, and I was happy with that knowledge. The company was in my blood. When it came time for college applications, I only had one goal: to get into the best business school possible. I studied relentlessly for my SATs, volunteered for leadership positions in every club I could join, and wrote my application essays about the family business and my plans to grow it. When the acceptance letter from Wharton arrived, Dad framed it and hung it in his office. "The first real CEO in the family," he announced proudly. "My daughter's going to take Johnson Manufacturing to heights I never could." Those words meant everything to me. They were validation for all the birthday parties I'd skipped to study, all the teenage milestones I'd missed because I was working at the plant. I was on a different path than my peers, but it was the right path for me. I was the heir apparent, and I embraced the role completely. The summer before college, Dad took me into his office and closed the door. He sat me down across from his desk, not in the comfortable chairs he used for clients, but in the straight-backed chair reserved for serious business discussions. "Sarah," he said, his expression solemn, "I want to make something clear. When you come back from college, you're not starting at the top. You'll work your way up like everyone else." I nodded, not surprised. Dad had always emphasized earning your place. "I'll start wherever you think is best," I assured him. He smiled then, the lines around his eyes crinkling. "That's why you'll succeed. You understand that respect has to be earned." He leaned forward, his eyes intense. "This company will be your legacy, Sarah. Everything I've built has been for you." I remember feeling the weight of that promise, that responsibility. It wasn't a burden, it was an honor. I would make him proud. I would take what he'd built and multiply it. I would prove worthy of the faith he'd placed in me. That evening, as we drove home, Dad took an unexpected detour. He parked on a hillside overlooking the industrial district where our factory stood. "See that?" he said, pointing to our building, distinctive with its blue roof. "I remember when I signed the lease, I was terrified. I thought I'd made the biggest mistake of my life." He chuckled. "Now look at it. 30 employees. Orders from 3 states. And someday, under your leadership, who knows how far it will go." I stared at the factory, trying to see it through his eyes, not just as a building or a business, but as a dream made real through sheer force of will. "I won't let you down, Dad," I said quietly. He put his arm around my shoulders and squeezed. "I know you won't, Princess. This is what you were born for." What I didn't know then, couldn't have known, was that promises are fragile things, that words spoken with conviction can still be broken, that the future I saw so clearly would turn out to be nothing but an elaborate mirage. But in that moment, sitting beside my father, watching the sunset glint off the roof of what I believed would someday be mine, I was certain of my place in the world. I was the heir apparent, the chosen one, the keeper of the family legacy. If only I'd seen the signs sooner. College was the first time I'd ever been away from the family business for more than a weekend. That first semester, I called Dad twice a week, asking about new contracts, equipment issues, and employee concerns. Some of my roommates thought it was strange how obsessed I was with a manufacturing company instead of parties and campus life, but they didn't understand. This wasn't just a job or even a career path. It was my identity. I chose my classes strategically. Accounting, operations management, business law, everything that would prepare me to take over Johnson Manufacturing. While other students switched majors or explored different interests, I remained laser-focused. My advisor once suggested I might want to broaden my horizons, maybe take an art history class or study abroad. I politely declined. Every semester away from the company already felt too long. During breaks, while classmates posted pictures from Cancun or Europe, I was back at the plant, volunteering my time, soaking up knowledge. Dad would introduce me to suppliers and clients. "This is my daughter, Sarah. She's at Wharton, studying business. One day she'll be running things around here." The pride in his voice made all the sacrifices worthwhile. Dating was never a priority. I went on a few dates with classmates, but conversations inevitably circled back to the business. One guy told me, "It's like you're already married to your father's company." He wasn't wrong. I didn't have time for relationships that wouldn't contribute to my goals. My senior year, I was approached by several prestigious firms during campus recruiting, companies that my classmates would have killed to work for. When I declined interviews, my career counselor was baffled. "These are opportunities most students dream about," she said. "At least keep your options open." "My path is already set," I told her. "I'm going back to Johnson Manufacturing." She frowned. "Working for family can be complicated. You might want a few years of outside experience first." I thanked her for the advice but didn't take it. Why would I waste years building someone else's business when I could be building my own? I looked at him, confused. "Management trainee?" He smiled. "I've got an office set up for you. Executive track. You'll rotate through departments, get to know everything from a management perspective." I took a deep breath. "Dad, I appreciate that, but I want to start on the floor." "The floor?" He looked genuinely surprised. "Sarah, you've got a Wharton degree. You don't need to work the assembly line." "I know I don't need to. I want to. If I'm going to lead these people someday, I need them to respect me. Not just as your daughter, but as someone who understands their jobs from experience." I wouldn't have had it any other way. Those first months were harder than I expected. Physical labor for 10-hour shifts left me exhausted. Some employees resented me. They assumed I was spying for my father, or that I'd quit as soon as the work got tough. Others were overly helpful, thinking they could curry favor with the boss through me. I kept my head down and worked. I learned to operate every machine, memorized safety protocols, mastered quality control standards. My hands developed calluses. My designer clothes were replaced by sturdy work pants and steel-toed boots. At home, I'd collapse into bed, too tired for anything but sleep. Sometimes I'd hear Marcus playing video games into the early hours of the morning. He'd graduated from State College with a communications degree, but hadn't bothered looking for a job. "Taking time to find myself," he'd explain whenever Dad gently pressed him about his plans. After my shift one evening, I knocked on Dad's office door. "Do you have a minute?" I asked. He looked up from his computer. "For you?" "Always." I placed my proposal on his desk. "I think we can increase productivity by at least 15% with some process adjustments." He raised an eyebrow but took the report. "I'll look it over." 3 days later, he called a meeting with the production team. I sat in the back, still in my work uniform, as he outlined my proposed changes, without mentioning they came from me. "Any questions?" he asked when he finished. Jensen, my supervisor, spoke up. "With all due respect, sir, this looks good on paper, but it won't work on the floor. Whoever came up with this doesn't understand how things actually function day to day." Several others nodded in agreement. I felt my face flush with embarrassment. Dad's expression remained neutral. "Interesting perspective, Jensen. Sarah, what do you think?" All eyes turned to me. I stood, heart pounding. "I wrote the proposal," I said, "based on working alongside everyone in this room for the past 6 months. I've operated every machine, followed every procedure. The current setup worked when we had half the orders and half the staff. But we've outgrown it." For the next 20 minutes, I addressed each concern, drawing diagrams on the whiteboard, explaining the logic behind every suggested change. When I finished, the room was silent. Dad finally spoke. "Let's implement these changes on a trial basis. 1 month. If productivity increases as projected, we make them permanent." 1 month later, productivity was up 22%, better than I'd predicted. Quality control issues had decreased. Even employee satisfaction had improved because the work flowed more smoothly. Dad called me into his office after reviewing the numbers. "Congratulations," he said, handing me a new business card. "Sarah Johnson, Operations Manager." I stared at the card. "But Jensen is being promoted to another division. You've earned this, Sarah. Not because you're my daughter, but because you're the most qualified person for the job." That night, we celebrated as a family. Mom made my favorite meal. Dad opened an expensive bottle of wine. Even Marcus seemed genuinely happy for me. "To Sarah," Dad said, raising his glass, "who insisted on starting at the bottom and proved she belongs at the top." As we clinked glasses, I caught a glimpse of myself in the dining room mirror. Confident, accomplished, on the path I'd always envisioned. Everything was unfolding exactly as planned. Marcus left halfway through dinner to meet friends. As he grabbed his keys, Dad called after him. "Maybe it's time to think about your future, son. The company's growing. There could be a place for you, too." Little did I know that someday would come sooner than anyone expected, and with consequences I could never have imagined. The next 3 years were some of the best of my life. Under my management, the operations department ran like clockwork. Employee turnover dropped. Productivity metrics consistently exceeded targets. Dad gave me increasing autonomy, and I thrived on the responsibility. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday morning in March, everything changed. I was reviewing production schedules when Dad called an emergency management meeting. His face was grim as we gathered in the conference room. "Midwest Dynamics filed for bankruptcy this morning," he announced without preamble. My stomach dropped. Midwest was our largest client, accounting for nearly 40% of our annual revenue. The room erupted in panicked questions. Dad raised his hand for silence. "I've called in our accountant and lawyer to discuss options. The reality is, without that cash flow, we have maybe 2 months before we can't make payroll." I'd never seen my father look defeated before. His shoulders were slumped, the lines on his face suddenly deeper. This was the company he'd built from nothing, the legacy he'd created, and it was on the verge of collapse. The meeting lasted for hours. Various executives proposed cost-cutting measures, layoffs, reduced hours, halting expansion plans. The accountant ran numbers that grew increasingly dire. The lawyer outlined bankruptcy protections we might need to consider. Through it all, I sat quietly, running calculations in my head, considering alternatives. When the meeting finally adjourned, people filed out looking shell-shocked. I stayed behind with Dad. He was staring at the whiteboard covered in grim projections. "I'll need to start letting people go by the end of the week," he said quietly. "Not yet," I replied. "Give me 48 hours. He looked at me with weary eyes. "Sarah, I appreciate your optimism, but—" 48 hours, I repeated. "If I don't have a viable plan by then, we can start the layoffs." He studied me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. 48 hours. I didn't go home that night. Or the next. I worked straight through, fueled by coffee and determination. I analyzed every client account, every supplier relationship, every expense down to the box of paper clips. I made calls to industry contacts I'd developed, reached out to competitors, explored alternative markets for our manufacturing capabilities. By hour 40, I had the outline of a plan. By hour 46, I had supporting data. At hour 47, I knocked on Dad's office door with a 3-ring binder and a USB drive. "I need 20 minutes of your time," I said. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. Dark circles under his eyes told me he hadn't been sleeping either. I opened my laptop and pulled up the presentation I'd prepared. "We can't replace Midwest Dynamics with a single client," I began, "but we can replace them with multiple smaller ones. I've identified 17 companies that need our manufacturing capabilities but aren't large enough to have been on our radar before." I clicked through slides showing potential clients, estimated order volumes, and projected revenues. I've already spoken with 7 of them. 3 have expressed serious interest in placing orders immediately if we can meet their price points, which we can with some adjustments to our production schedule. Dad leaned forward, his expression cautiously hopeful. That still leaves a significant revenue gap, which is why we need to approach the bank about extending our line of credit, I continued. I've prepared financial projections showing how we'll return to profitability within 6 months. The key is keeping our core team intact so we can onboard these new clients efficiently. I took a deep breath before presenting the hardest part. That said, we can't avoid layoffs entirely. I've identified 22 positions we can eliminate temporarily without compromising essential operations. Dad winced. That's going to be difficult. It is, I agreed. But I've structured it as a furlough program. We keep them on health insurance and bring them back as revenue stabilizes. It's better than the alternative. For the next hour, Dad grilled me on every aspect of the plan, the assumptions, the risks, the timelines. I had answers ready, backed by data and analysis. Finally, he sat back in his chair. "This could work," he said quietly. Then, more firmly, "This will work." The next few weeks were the most challenging of my career. Dad put me in charge of implementing the recovery plan. I worked 18-hour days, negotiating with the bank, courting new clients, restructuring operations to accommodate smaller, more diverse orders. The furlough announcement was met with tears and anger, even though we'd kept the cuts as limited as possible. I personally met with each affected employee, explaining the situation and our commitment to bringing them back when circumstances allowed. Some days, it felt like pushing a boulder uphill. A major supplier demanded payment terms we couldn't meet. The bank hesitated on extending our credit line. 2 promising client prospects backed out at the last minute. Through it all, I refused to give up. When one approach failed, I tried another. When a door closed, I found a window. I called in every favor, leveraged every relationship, explored options others might have dismissed as too difficult or too unconventional. Gradually, painfully, the tide began to turn. We secured 5 new clients in the first month. The bank approved our credit extension, impressed by the detailed recovery plan and our early progress. We streamlined operations further, cutting costs without sacrificing quality. By month 3, we'd stabilized enough to bring back the first wave of furloughed employees. By month 5, all but 4 positions had been restored. And by month 6, we were operating at 92% of our pre-crisis revenue, with a more diverse client base that reduced our vulnerability to any single customer's fortunes. Throughout this period, Dad was supportive but largely hands-off. He attended key meetings, signed necessary documents, and made himself available for strategic discussions. But day to day, he let me lead. One evening, after reviewing the latest financial reports showing our first profitable month since the crisis began, Dad poured 2 glasses of scotch and handed one to me. "To Sarah," he said, raising his glass, "who saved this company when even I was ready to give up." We clinked glasses, and I felt a surge of pride unlike anything I'd experienced before. This wasn't an academic achievement or a theoretical exercise. This was real. Jobs preserved, a family legacy protected, a future secured. "I couldn't have done it without the foundation you built," I said. Dad shook his head. "Don't minimize what you've accomplished. I built this company, yes, but you just transformed it. You've proven yourself in fire, Sarah. There's nothing you can't handle." The next day, Dad called an all-staff meeting. Standing before the assembled employees, he made an announcement that caught me completely by surprise. Effective immediately, Sarah Johnson is being promoted to Chief Operating Officer of Johnson Manufacturing. Applause erupted, genuine and enthusiastic. These people had watched me fight for their jobs, work alongside them through the crisis, and lead the company back from the brink. The respect in their eyes meant everything. As the meeting dispersed, an unexpected figure appeared in the doorway. Marcus, my brother, dressed in business casual attire instead of his usual jeans and t-shirt. "Congratulations, sis," he said, giving me a quick hug. "Dad told me what you've done here. Pretty impressive." "Thanks," I replied, surprised by his presence. "What brings you by the plant?" He shrugged, attempting casualness but not quite succeeding. "Just thought maybe it's time I see what the family business is all about. Dad mentioned there might be a place for me here." I glanced at our father, who was watching us with an unreadable expression. "Of course, there's a place for you," Dad said, walking over. "We can always use more Johnsons in Johnson Manufacturing." Something in his tone made me pause. There was an eagerness, an enthusiasm that seemed disproportionate to Marcus's half-hearted interest. But I pushed the thought aside. We were family. The company was growing again. There would be opportunities for everyone. How could I have known that this moment, my brother's casual entrance into the business I'd given everything to save, would eventually lead to the greatest betrayal of my life? With the crisis behind us, I was eager to do more than just recover. I wanted to grow. During the darkest days of our financial troubles, I'd glimpsed opportunities we'd never pursued, markets we'd never explored. Now, as COO, I had the authority to chase them. I developed a 5-year strategic plan that was ambitious by any standard. Dad raised his eyebrows when I presented it in his office. "You want to triple our size in 5 years?" he asked, flipping through the projections. "I think we can do it in 4, I replied confidently. "But I built in some buffer time." He chuckled, but there was pride in his eyes. When did my cautious daughter become such a risk-taker? "When I realized that not taking risks is the biggest risk of all," I said. "The manufacturing landscape is changing. If we don't grow, we'll eventually be swallowed up by companies that did." Dad studied me for a long moment. "You really believe in this, don't you?" He nodded slowly. "Then let's do it. I trust your judgment." Those 4 simple words, "I trust your judgment," were more valuable to me than any promotion or bonus could have been. Dad wasn't just my father or my boss. He was my mentor, the person whose approval I'd sought my entire life. Having earned his trust felt like the culmination of years of hard work. It was the largest capital expenditure in company history. The board meeting to approve it was tense, with several longtime members expressing concerns about the cost and implementation timeline. I addressed each objection with detailed analysis and contingency plans. In the end, the vote was unanimous in favor. Implementation wasn't without challenges. Integration of the new systems caused production delays. Training employees on the new equipment took longer than anticipated. For several weeks, I practically lived at the factory, troubleshooting problems and reassuring nervous staff. But once the systems were fully operational, the results were transformative. Production capacity increased by 65%. Quality metrics improved across all product lines. Energy costs decreased by nearly 30%. Most importantly, we could now manufacture components with tolerances our competitors couldn't match, opening doors to higher margin contracts in aerospace and medical device manufacturing. While overseeing the modernization, I was also focused on international expansion. Johnson Manufacturing had always been a domestic operation, but I saw untapped potential in overseas markets, particularly in Europe and Asia. I hired a consultant with international experience to help navigate the complexities of global business, from export regulations to cultural differences in negotiation styles. Our first international contract came from a German automotive supplier. It was modest in size but strategically significant. I flew to Munich for the final negotiations and signing ceremony. When I called Dad to share the news, He was ecstatic. "Your grandfather would have never believed it," he said. "A Johnson manufacturing component in a German luxury car. You're taking us places I never imagined, Sarah." As international orders grew, we had to expand our physical facilities. We purchased adjacent land and broke ground on a 50,000 square foot addition to our main plant. On the day of the groundbreaking ceremony, I stood beside Dad as he addressed the gathered employees, suppliers, and local officials. The professional success was exhilarating, but it came at a personal cost. My already limited social life essentially disappeared. I canceled the few dates I managed to schedule when work inevitably ran long. Friends stopped calling after I missed too many dinners and birthdays. Even family gatherings were often interrupted by urgent calls from the plant. Mom worried about me. "You're working too hard," she'd say during the rare Sunday dinners I made it home for. "There's more to life than the company, Sarah." But I didn't see it that way. The company wasn't just work. It was my passion, my purpose, my legacy. Every sacrifice felt worthwhile when I saw the growth numbers, the new opportunities we were creating. In the midst of all this expansion, I scarcely paid attention to Marcus's integration into the company. Dad had created a position for him, strategy director, though the role's responsibilities seemed vague at best. From what I could gather, Marcus primarily attended client meetings, industry conferences, and networking events. Occasionally, we'd cross paths in the hallway or at management meetings. He'd offer generic observations about market trends or brand positioning that sounded like they came straight from a business school textbook. I'd nod politely but focus on operational matters that needed my attention. If I'm being honest, a part of me resented how easily Marcus had slipped into an executive role. I had started on the factory floor, earned every promotion through measurable achievements. Marcus had essentially walked in off the street into a director-level position with no relevant experience or demonstrated skills. But I kept these thoughts to myself. Dad seemed pleased to have both his children involved in the business, and I didn't want to spoil that for him. Besides, I was too busy growing the company to worry about my brother's role in it. 3 years into my 5-year plan, we hit a major milestone: $50 million in annual revenue with healthy profit margins. The board voted to issue bonuses to the executive team, including a substantial one for me. For the first time, I allowed myself to indulge a little, buying a luxury condo in the city to eliminate my commute and investing in a wardrobe that befitted a C-suite executive. "Marcus has some interesting ideas about potential acquisitions," he explained. "We're just exploring options." "These are intriguing concepts," I said carefully, "but we should run the numbers more thoroughly before proceeding. Acquisitions are complex, and integration challenges can derail even the best strategic fit." "No," I agreed. "But failing to do proper due diligence is how companies end up with expensive mistakes." There was an uncomfortable silence before Dad changed the subject. As the meeting wrapped up, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd interrupted something I wasn't meant to be part of. That night, lying awake in my condo, I wondered if I was being paranoid. Dad had always been my champion, my mentor. The company's tremendous growth had happened under my leadership. Surely my position was secure. The next morning, I arrived at work with renewed determination. There was a major production issue to solve, a new international client to court, and expansion plans to finalize. I threw myself into these challenges, pushing aside concerns about Marcus's growing influence with Dad. Had I recognized these warning signs for what they were, had I understood the subtle shift taking place, perhaps I could have prepared myself for what was coming. But I was blinded by faith in meritocracy, in the belief that my proven track record would outweigh whatever charm or familial bond Marcus shared with our father. It was a costly misconception, one I would come to regret. The transition from a $50 million company to a $100 million company isn't just about doubling in size. It's an entirely different game with higher stakes, more complex challenges, and greater rewards. I was determined to play it brilliantly. My next big move was acquiring our largest competitor, Reynolds Manufacturing. They had complementary product lines, a strong presence in markets we were trying to penetrate, and a founder who was approaching retirement age. It was the perfect opportunity to accelerate our growth trajectory. I spent months preparing for the acquisition, studying their financials, identifying synergies, planning integration strategies. When I finally presented the proposal to Dad and the board, I had answers for every possible question. "This is aggressive," Dad said, reviewing the $15 million purchase price. "But the strategic rationale is compelling." The board agreed, approving the pursuit of the acquisition. I was given authorization to begin formal negotiations. What followed were the most intense 3 months of my career. Reynolds' owner, Bill Reynolds, was a shrewd negotiator who knew exactly what his company was worth. We went back and forth on terms, valuation, transition plans, and employee retention. I practically lived in conference rooms and lawyers' offices, emerging only to brief Dad and the board on progress. Marcus attended some of these meetings, though his contributions were minimal. Mostly he observed, occasionally asking questions that revealed his limited understanding of the manufacturing business or acquisition processes. Finally, after countless late nights and tense negotiations, we reached an agreement. The day we signed the contracts, I felt a rush of accomplishment unlike anything I'd experienced before. This wasn't just an operational improvement or a new client win. This was transformational growth that would reshape our company's future. 6 months post-acquisition, the results were exceeding even my optimistic projections. Revenue was up 40% year over year. Cost savings from consolidated operations were 15% higher than forecast. Employee retention from Reynolds was at 92%, well above the industry average for acquisitions. With this success under my belt, I turned my attention to another opportunity: venture capital funding. Historically, Johnson Manufacturing had relied on bank loans and reinvested profits for growth. But to reach the next level, we needed a significant capital infusion. I researched potential investors, focusing on firms with experience in manufacturing and family businesses. After initial meetings with several candidates, I identified Horizon Partners as the ideal match. They understood our industry, appreciated our culture, and were willing to take a minority position that wouldn't threaten family control. When I brought the opportunity to Dad, his reaction surprised me. "I've never been comfortable with outside investors," he said, frowning. "They always want more control than they initially ask for." "Horizon is different," I assured him. "They specialize in family businesses. Their track record shows they respect founder vision." Dad was unconvinced. "Let me think about it." The next day, he called me into his office. Marcus was already there, lounging in a chair. "Marcus has an interesting alternative to venture capital," Dad said. "I'd like you to hear him out." Marcus straightened up, clearly pleased with himself. "We don't need outside investors. We can fund our next phase of growth through strategic partnerships with our largest customers. They prepay for guaranteed capacity. We use that capital for expansion." I kept my expression neutral, though internally I was incredulous. Customer prepayments are unlikely to provide the scale of capital we need, and they create dependencies that could become problematic if market conditions change. "It's worked for other companies," Marcus countered. "Tesla did it." "We're not Tesla," I replied. "We don't have their brand power or consumer loyalty." The conversation continued in this vein, Marcus offering superficial solutions, me explaining the practical complexities he was overlooking. But what troubled me wasn't just his naivety. It was Dad's receptiveness to his half-baked ideas. Eventually, Dad made a Solomon-like decision. "We'll pursue both approaches." Sarah, continue discussions with Horizon. Marcus, explore the partnership concept with our top 3 customers. I left that meeting with a growing sense of unease. The dynamic was shifting in ways I couldn't quite articulate. Nevertheless, I pushed forward with the Horizon negotiations, securing a term sheet for a $25 million investment at a valuation that recognized the company's growth potential. Meanwhile, Marcus's customer partnership initiative yielded only vague expressions of interest with onerous terms. When presented with both options, the board unanimously supported the Horizon deal. Even Dad had to acknowledge it was clearly superior. We closed the investment 3 months later, providing capital for our next phase of growth. With fresh funding in place, I launched a comprehensive rebranding initiative. Johnson Manufacturing had outgrown its modest origins. We needed an identity that reflected our expanded capabilities and global reach. I hired a top branding agency to refresh everything from our logo, to our website, to our corporate messaging. The result was a modern, sophisticated brand that positioned us as an industry leader rather than a regional player. As the company transformed externally, I also drove internal changes to support our growth. We implemented state-of-the-art enterprise software, recruited executives with experience at larger organizations, and formalized procedures that had previously been ad hoc. These changes weren't always popular. Some longtime employees grumbled about corporate bureaucracy and losing the family feel. Dad occasionally expressed concern that we were becoming too corporate, too fast. We need these systems to support our size, I explained. What worked at 10 million won't work at 100 million. He nodded reluctantly. I understand the necessity, but don't lose sight of what made this company special in the first place. I took his concerns seriously, working to preserve our core values even as we evolved. We maintained traditions like the annual company picnic and personal birthday cards from leadership. I still walked the factory floor regularly, knowing employees by name and asking about their families. As we approached the magical $100 million revenue mark, I felt a profound sense of accomplishment. The small company I'd grown up visiting after school was now an industry powerhouse. The journey had been challenging, but every sacrifice had been worthwhile. Dad suggested we plan a celebration when we officially crossed the threshold. A milestone like this deserves recognition, he said. A chance to reflect on how far we've come and where we're headed. I agreed, working with our events team to organize a gala dinner at the city's finest hotel. We invited employees, board members, key clients, and community leaders who had supported our growth. I even flew in international partners from Europe and Asia, wanting them to feel part of our extended family. The night of the celebration arrived, and I felt a rare moment of personal satisfaction as I dressed for the event. I chose a designer dress in Johnson Manufacturing blue, subtle but symbolic. This was as much a personal triumph as a professional one, the culmination of a lifetime dedicated to the family business. The ballroom was elegantly decorated, with displays chronicling the company's history from its humble beginnings to its current success. Cocktail hour buzzed with conversation as guests congratulated me on the company's remarkable growth. Dinner was served, and then it was time for speeches. As COO, I would speak first, followed by Dad as CEO and founder. I had prepared carefully, wanting to acknowledge every person and department that had contributed to our success. As I approached the podium, I surveyed the room. Hundreds of people whose livelihoods were connected to the company I had helped build. The pride I felt in that moment was immeasurable. My speech received a standing ovation. As the applause died down, Dad took the stage, his expression warm with pride. 30 years ago, he began, I started this company with a second-hand lathe and a dream. Never in my wildest imagination did I envision what it would become. He paused, looking around the room. Tonight, We celebrate crossing the $100 million threshold, a remarkable achievement made possible by every person in this room. He continued, acknowledging key milestones and contributors. Then he turned toward me. I want to give special recognition to my daughter, Sarah, whose leadership has been instrumental in our growth. Her vision, determination, and business acumen have taken Johnson Manufacturing to heights I never could have achieved alone. The room erupted in applause again. I felt tears threatening as Dad smiled at me with genuine admiration. And now, he continued as the applause died down, I have an important announcement to make. He paused, his smile widening as he gestured toward the side of the stage. As we enter this new chapter of our company's history, I've decided it's time for me to step back. Effective next month, I'll be transitioning to executive chairman. My heart raced with anticipation. This was it, the moment I'd been working toward my entire life. The culmination of every sacrifice, every long night, every difficult decision. And I'm delighted to announce, Dad continued, still smiling broadly, that my son, Marcus, will be taking over as CEO. The words hit me like a physical blow. For a moment, I thought I'd misheard. But then Marcus was walking onto the stage, accepting Dad's handshake, waving to the applauding crowd. I sat frozen, my face a mask of professional composure while inside. My world collapsed. As champagne glasses clinked around me celebrating my brother's ascension, I felt a cold realization wash over me. Everything I thought I knew about my place in the family, in the company, in my father's plans. It had all been an illusion. Somehow, I made it through the rest of that evening. I smiled, accepted congratulations for the company's success, and nodded politely when people expressed excitement about the next generation of leadership, as if Marcus represented that future rather than me. My face ached from maintaining the facade of approval. As the celebration wound down, I slipped away without saying goodbye to anyone. I needed to be alone. In my car, I finally allowed the tears to come. Tears of anger, betrayal, and gut-wrenching disappointment. How could Dad do this? How could he not even have discussed it with me first? I drove aimlessly for hours, replaying moments from the past several years, searching for clues I might have missed. The special meetings between Dad and Marcus, the gradual inclusion of my brother in strategic decisions, the subtle shift in Dad's attitude toward my ideas versus Marcus's. I'd noticed these things but dismissed them, never believing they could lead to this outcome. The following morning, I arrived at the office earlier than usual. I needed time to compose myself before facing everyone. But Dad was already there, waiting in my office. "I thought you might come in early," he said, his expression unreadable. I closed the door behind me, determined to remain professional despite the hurricane of emotions inside me. "You blindsided me last night," I said quietly. Dad sighed. "I know, and I apologize for that. I should have discussed it with you privately before making the announcement." "That's what you're apologizing for? The timing? Not the decision itself?" He shifted uncomfortably. "Sarah, you need to understand." "What I understand," I interrupted, "is that I've dedicated my entire life to this company. I started on the factory floor. I saved us from bankruptcy. I grew us from a regional manufacturer to a global enterprise. And my reward is to be passed over for someone with a fraction of my experience and commitment." Dad frowned. "This isn't about who deserves what. It's about what's best for the company moving forward." I laughed incredulously. "And you think Marcus is what's best for the company? He's been here 4 years, in a role you created specifically for him. He has no operational experience, no industry expertise." "He has other qualities that are valuable," Dad insisted. "He's personable, good with clients. He has fresh perspectives. Fresh perspectives? I echoed. Dad, he suggested we fund our expansion through customer prepayments like we're some kind of Kickstarter campaign. Dad's expression hardened. That's enough, Sarah. The decision has been made. The board has approved it. He looked away. There was a special session. That I wasn't invited to, I finished. How convenient. We stared at each other across a chasm that seemed unbridgeable. This man who had been my hero, my mentor, suddenly felt like a stranger. The company needs a man's leadership to maintain investor confidence, Dad said finally. The words hung in the air between us, their meaning gradually sinking in. So, that's it, I said softly. All this time, it was never about merit or capability. It was about gender. Dad had the decency to look uncomfortable. That's not entirely fair. It's about perception in the industry. Manufacturing is still a man's world, Sarah. Our clients, our investors, they expect certain things. And you're too weak to challenge those expectations, I said. Even when your own daughter has proven them wrong, time and again. His face flushed with anger. I've built this company from nothing. Every decision I've made has been to ensure its survival and success, including using me to do the hard work of building it up for Marcus, I said, a terrible realization dawning. That was always the plan, wasn't it? You never intended for me to lead. Dad's silence was answer enough. I'll expect your support during the transition, he said finally. Marcus will need your operational knowledge. I stared at him, hardly recognizing the man before me. You'll have my professionalism, I said coldly. Nothing more. The next few weeks were excruciating. News of the succession plans spread throughout the company. Some employees seemed genuinely confused by the decision, approaching me privately to express their surprise. Others quickly aligned themselves with Marcus, sensing where future power would lie. Marcus himself alternated between awkward attempts at collaboration and thinly veiled assertions of his new authority. He moved into the CEO's office, which had been redesigned and furnished at considerable expense, before Dad had even vacated it. What do you think? He asked, gesturing around at the modern furniture and expensive art that had replaced Dad's practical, understated decor. More fitting for a company of our stature, don't you think? I said nothing, focusing instead on the transition documentation I'd prepared. Clinical, comprehensive, and completely devoid of the insights that can only come from years of hands-on experience. Board meetings became increasingly tense. Marcus began implementing changes that reversed key strategic initiatives I had put in place. He diverted resources from our successful international expansion to pursue domestic clients with limited growth potential. He disbanded the innovation team I had established and redirected their budget to marketing and rebranding efforts. Each time I raised concerns, Dad would intervene with platitudes about fresh approaches and giving new ideas a chance. The other board members, many of whom owed their positions to my father, rarely challenged him. After one particularly frustrating meeting where Marcus announced plans to halt our digital transformation initiative, I confronted him privately. You're undermining years of strategic planning, I said. That initiative is critical to our competitive positioning. Marcus leaned back in his chair, Dad's chair, with casual dismissiveness. It's expensive and the ROI is uncertain. We need to focus on sure things. The ROI was clearly outlined in the proposal, I argued. It's been approved by the board twice. Things change, he replied with a shrug. The board has new priorities now. Your priorities, you mean, I corrected. Based on what? Your extensive experience in manufacturing operations? His expression hardened. Careful, Sarah. I'm CEO now. You need to respect that. Respect is earned, I replied. It doesn't come with a title. As I turned to leave, he called after me. By the way, I've been reviewing your department budgets. There's significant fat to trim there. It was a threat, thinly veiled but unmistakable. He was reminding me that he now controlled my resources, my team, my projects. That evening, I received an unexpected call from Kevin Porter, one of our board members and the CEO of a major client company. He asked to meet privately, away from the office. Over dinner at a discreet restaurant, Kevin expressed what I had suspected. Many were concerned about Marcus's leadership, but unwilling to challenge Dad. Several board members wanted you as CEO, he confided. Your track record speaks for itself. But your father was persuasive. Meaning? I asked. Kevin hesitated. He made it clear that his shares would be voted as a block. With his ownership percentage, plus a few loyalists, he had the votes. What will you do now? Kevin asked. It was the question I'd been avoiding for weeks. What would I do? Stay and watch Marcus dismantle everything I'd built? Leave and start over elsewhere? Neither option seemed bearable. I don't know yet, I admitted, but I appreciate your candor. The following day, during my regular factory walkthrough, a longtime employee approached me. Barbara had been with the company for 20 years, since before I started working there. We miss your father, she said, but we were all expecting you to take over. You're the one who knows this business inside and out. Her words touched me deeply. Thank you, Barbara. That means a lot. She glanced around to ensure no one was listening. Things are changing already, and not for the better. Quality standards are slipping. Production targets are being pushed beyond what's realistic. People are worried. That conversation was a turning point. Until then, I'd been too caught up in my personal disappointment to fully grasp the broader implications of Marcus's leadership. Now I began paying closer attention to operational indicators, and what I saw alarmed me. Quality metrics were indeed declining. Customer complaints were increasing. Key personnel were updating their resumes. The vibrant, innovative culture I'd fostered was being replaced by an atmosphere of uncertainty and fear. Marcus was systematically dismantling the foundation of our success, either out of ignorance or deliberate rejection of everything associated with me. And Dad was letting it happen, too proud or stubborn to admit he'd made a catastrophic mistake. It was time to make a decision about my future. I could stay and fight a losing battle against my own brother and father, or I could leave and build something new. Neither option was what I had spent my life preparing for, but only one offered the possibility of redemption and renewal. That night, I drafted my resignation letter. Simple, professional, effective immediately. No recriminations, no detailed explanations. Those would have fallen on deaf ears anyway. As I typed the final lines, I felt something unexpected. Not just anger or disappointment, but a strange sense of liberation. For the first time in my adult life, my future was entirely my own to shape. The morning after writing my resignation, I arrived at the office earlier than usual. I wanted to leave my letter on Dad's desk before anyone else arrived. No dramatic scenes, no tearful goodbyes, just a clean break. But as I approached his office, I saw the light was already on. Dad was inside, reviewing documents. Some habits never change. He'd always been an early riser. He looked up as I entered, his expression softening slightly. Despite everything, there was still that flicker of fatherly affection. It made what I had to do both harder and more necessary. Sarah, he said, good morning. I was hoping we could discuss the quarterly projections today. Marcus has some concerns about... I placed the envelope on his desk, interrupting him. My resignation. Effective immediately. The words hung in the air between us. Dad stared at the envelope as if it might explode. You can't be serious, he said finally. I've never been more serious about anything in my life. He opened the envelope with unsteady hands, scanning the brief letter inside. This is an emotional reaction. You need to think this through. I've thought of nothing else for weeks, I replied. This company was my life. I gave everything to it. My time, my energy, my personal relationships. I did it willingly because I believed I was building my future. Now, I see that was never the plan. Dad stood up, his expression pleading. Sarah, be reasonable. You're COO of a $100 million company. Most people would kill for that position. Most people haven't been lied to their entire lives, I replied evenly. Most people haven't built a company for someone else to run into the ground. Marcus is learning, Dad insisted. He needs time, guidance. He needs competence, experience, and vision, none of which he has. I took a deep breath. But that's not my problem anymore. It's yours. Dad's expression hardened. If you walk out that door, you're turning your back on your family, on your inheritance, on everything we've built together. No, I said quietly. You did that the moment you chose Marcus over me, despite knowing I was the better choice. You chose your outdated beliefs over your daughter's proven abilities. That's on you, not me. As I turned to leave, Dad called after me. Marcus is struggling. The transition isn't going as smoothly as we hoped. He needs your help, Sarah. I paused in the doorway, his words stirring a complex mix of emotions. Part of me, the dutiful daughter who had spent her life seeking his approval, wanted to turn back, to fix the problems as I always had. But another part, the woman who had finally recognized her own worth, knew that would only perpetuate the cycle. You didn't believe I could lead, I said without turning around, but you know I can leave. With those words, I walked out of my father's office for the last time. I went straight to my office, collected the few personal items I cared about, and left before most employees had arrived. No dramatic exit, no burned bridges, just the quiet close of one chapter and the beginning of another. The first few weeks of unemployment were disorienting. For the first time since college, my days had no structure, no urgent deadlines, no responsibility for others' livelihoods. I allowed myself a brief period of rest, sleeping past 6 a.m., taking long walks, reading books that weren't business-related. But inactivity didn't suit me for long. Ideas began percolating, not just for what I wanted to do next, but for how I wanted to do it. I'd learned invaluable lessons at Johnson Manufacturing, both about business operations and about human nature. Now I had the opportunity to apply those lessons on my own terms. I began researching market gaps that aligned with my manufacturing expertise. Through industry contacts, I discovered a niche that larger companies, including Johnson Manufacturing, had overlooked: specialized components for renewable energy systems. The market was growing rapidly, but was underserved by existing manufacturers. With a clear vision in mind, I created a business plan and began reaching out to potential investors. My track record spoke for itself. Within weeks, I had funding commitments exceeding my initial targets. One investor, after reviewing my proposal, said simply, "I don't know what Johnson Manufacturing was thinking letting you go, but their loss is our gain." Next came the practical considerations: finding suitable facilities, sourcing equipment, building a team. For the location, I deliberately chose a site across town from Johnson Manufacturing. Close enough to access the same talent pool, but far enough to avoid daily reminders of what I'd left behind. Equipment was a significant investment, but my industry knowledge allowed me to find quality used machinery at favorable prices. I was more selective with technology, investing in cutting-edge systems that would give us a competitive advantage from day one. Building my team was the most gratifying part of the process. I started with key personnel I trusted, not by poaching from Johnson Manufacturing, though several reached out when they heard about my new venture. Instead, I focused on industry talent that complemented my skills and shared my vision for an innovative, employee-centered company. 3 months after my resignation, Phoenix Manufacturing opened its doors. The name was deliberate, a new entity rising from the ashes of my past. Our mission statement reflected my values: quality without compromise, innovation without ego, success through shared vision. Starting fresh was both terrifying and exhilarating. Without the safety net of an established company, every decision had immediate consequences. But there was also freedom in beginning with a clean slate. No outdated processes to reform, no entrenched attitudes to change, no family dynamics to navigate. I implemented the management philosophies I'd always believed in but couldn't fully realize at Johnson. Transparent communication at all levels, merit-based advancement regardless of gender or background, shared rewards for shared success. The culture we created attracted top talent, many expressing relief at finding a workplace where their contributions would be valued based on results, not relationships. The early months were challenging, as they are for any startup. There were equipment failures, supply chain disruptions, and the inevitable cash flow concerns. But there was also a spirit of collective determination that I'd never experienced before. A team united not by family obligation, but by shared purpose. 6 months in, we secured our first major contract, a component order for a leading solar panel manufacturer. 9 months in, we were operating at full capacity and planning an expansion. By our 1-year anniversary, Phoenix Manufacturing had established a reputation for innovation and reliability that companies twice our age would envy. It was around this time that I received an unexpected call from my father. We hadn't spoken since the day I resigned. "How are you, Sarah?" he asked, his voice carrying the weight of unspoken regrets. "I'm well," I replied, keeping my tone professional. "And you?" There was a pause. "Things have been challenging. The company is struggling." I wasn't surprised. Industry contacts had kept me informed about Johnson Manufacturing's declining performance, missed deliveries, quality issues, key client departures. The downward spiral I'd predicted was happening even faster than I'd anticipated. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, and meant it. Despite everything, I took no pleasure in seeing the company my grandfather had founded, the one I'd helped build, falter. "Marcus is..." Dad hesitated. "He's finding the role more difficult than expected. The board is concerned." I waited, sensing there was more. "We'd like you to consider coming back," he finally said. "In any capacity you choose. The company needs you, Sarah." For a brief moment, I was tempted. Not by the offer itself, but by the validation it represented. They needed me. They recognized their mistake, but I also recognized the familiar pattern. I would be expected to fix the problems while someone else took the credit. "I appreciate the offer," I said carefully, "but I've moved on. Phoenix is growing quickly, and my focus is here now." Dad's disappointment was palpable even over the phone. "I understand," he said quietly. "You've built something impressive, from what I hear." "Thank you," I replied, surprised by his acknowledgement. There was an awkward pause before he spoke again. "I was wrong, Sarah, about many things. I hope someday you can forgive me." The words I'd once longed to hear now brought a complicated mix of emotions: vindication, lingering hurt, and a kind of peace. "I'm working on it," I said honestly. "It will take time." After we hung up, I stood by my office window, looking out at the production floor of Phoenix Manufacturing. My team was busy, focused, united in purpose. In just 18 months, we'd grown from an idea to a thriving business with 37 employees and a healthy order backlog. 2 weeks later, I received another unexpected call, this time from Marcus. "We need to talk," he said without preamble. "The company's in trouble." We met at a neutral location, a coffee shop halfway between our respective businesses. Marcus looked haggard, the confident swagger replaced by nervous exhaustion. "Dad won't admit it," he said, "but we're 6 months from bankruptcy at our current trajectory. The bank is threatening to call our loans. Key clients are leaving." He pushed a folder across the table. "I want to sell you the company." I stared at him, momentarily speechless. "You want to sell me Johnson Manufacturing?" He nodded. "You built it once. Maybe you can save it again." I opened the folder, reviewing the proposed terms. The valuation was reasonable, perhaps even slightly undervalued given the company's potential if properly managed. But as I looked at the familiar logo, the decades of history, I realized something profound. "I'm not interested," I said, closing the folder and sliding it back. Marcus looked stunned. "What? This is what you always wanted." I shook my head. What I always wanted was to lead the company I helped build. That opportunity is gone. I gestured toward the window where Phoenix's newly installed sign was visible in the distance. "I'm too busy building my legacy now." As I walked away, I felt a weight lift that I hadn't even realized I was carrying. The company I was meant to inherit wasn't my father's. It was the one I created myself. Today, Phoenix Manufacturing is valued at over $150 million, with operations in 3 countries. We're known for our innovation, quality, and workplace culture. Former employees of Johnson Manufacturing regularly apply to join us, seeking the leadership and vision that left with me. As for Johnson Manufacturing, they were eventually acquired by a larger competitor, at a fraction of what the company was worth when I left. Dad retired shortly after, a quieter man than the one who had once promised me the world. Marcus moved across the country to pursue real estate development, as far from manufacturing as he could get. Sometimes I wonder what might have happened if things had been different. If Dad had kept his promise, if merit had mattered more than gender, if family loyalty had been a two-way street. But those thoughts are increasingly rare. The betrayal that once defined me has become just another chapter in my story. Not the conclusion, but the catalyst for something better. The company I built from nothing now eclipses the one that was never truly meant to be mine. Sometimes the greatest gift is realizing that what you thought you wanted isn't what you needed at all. The legacy I was chasing wasn't mine to inherit. It was mine to create. And that's exactly what I did.